Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm John Tierney. Welcome to the Museum of Sex here. I am here to talk with Roy Baumeister at this event. Thank you, Reason Magazine, for sponsoring this, and thank you, Dan Gluck, for inviting us here. I'm here to talk with Roy Baumeister, my co-author of the book Willpower, and we want to talk about that subject, about New Year's resolutions, and we want to also unveil a strategy, a self-help strategy that, as far as I know, is the only one to have been field tested in the Oval Office. After President Barack Obama read our work, he changed his daily routine to improve his decision-making. Now, I'm not saying he made all the right decisions since then. I imagine there are some people here who do not regard him as the Solomon of our age. But I want to assure you that if he had not followed the strategy that Roy and I developed, that things today would be much worse. and I also want to assure you that it was not used, this strategy was not used to develop the healthcare.gov website. Now, I realize that there are probably many people here who are tired of hearing exhortations and lectures from self-improvement gurus. And believe me, I feel your pain. I have read more bad self-help books than Oprah and Dr. Phil combined. That's what got me into this collaboration with Roy, really. It started indirectly for me, where I was at dinner one night with Christopher Buckley, the comic novelist, and we were talking about the deep philosophical subject that always comes up when writers get together, which is money. And we decided that we needed more of it. And we were so jealous of the mega sales of self-help books that we decided to write one of our own. And it was a comic novel titled God is My Broker. And we revealed the 7.5 laws of spiritual and financial growth. These were eternal truths like money is God's way of saying thanks. And my favorite law was, as long as God knows the truth, it doesn't matter what you tell your customers. Now, in writing this book, I went back through the history of the self-help genre, all the way from Ben Franklin to the present. And I noticed this sort of curious trend. If you went back in the 19th century and the Victorians, the self-help books then emphasized perseverance and hard work. They had maxims like, genius is patience. But then when you moved into the modern era, you got these books promising quick fixes and self-esteem and the sort of feel-good philosophy with a rhyming slogan, believe it, achieve it. You know, Deepak Chopra had something he called the law of least effort. And I'll quote it verbatim. It said, ultimately, you come to the state where you do nothing and accomplish everything. You know, I guess it worked for him, you know, but you know, to me it seemed there had been this weird backward evolution, that the old books were better than the new books. And I didn't know what to make of this until I started writing a science column for the New York Times, and I met Roy Baumeister. I heard he's one of the most prolific social psychologists on the planet. And Roy got his start. He was one of the early leaders in the research into self-esteem, which showed that people who are more confident, people with more confidence in themselves tend to be happier and more successful. But then Roy realized that the researchers had it backwards, that self-esteem does not lead to success, rather success leads to self-esteem. You know, winning the Nobel Prize will make you feel good about yourself, but feeling good about yourself will not get you to Stockholm. If it did, Donald Trump would be there every year. So Roy looked at dozens of personality traits, and he found that only one of them predicted how well a student would do in college. And that trait, it was not self-esteem, it was self-control. And this was something that had been kind of out of fashion, but more and more studies started showing that no matter what kind of successful outcome you looked at it, in school, in careers, in marriages, in relationships, financial security, health, that in general there were two qualities that correlate with success. And one of them is intelligence, the other is self-control. And so far researchers haven't figured out what to do about intelligence, but they have rediscovered how to improve self-control. And they have rediscovered the concept of willpower, which until Roy came along, scientists in the 20th century had looked on willpower as this kind of quaint metaphor invented by uptight Victorians. You know, Victorians thought of the body like there was a steam engine inside you, and when you had some terrible temptation, like, you know, like the sight of a bare ankle, you just powered up the steam engine and you went and you took a cold shower. And now, the Victorians were rather odd. I don't think they'd be really comfortable here at the Museum of Sex. But Roy discovered that they actually were correct. I mean, not about everything. He doesn't share their ankle fetish. But he discovered that they were right about willpower. And I'd like Roy now to tell us why, how that happened.
Well, we started doing experiments. I mean, first I surveyed the literature, and I thought, well, this could be that the willpower thing seemed viable, that there was some energy. At the time, nobody in psychology was using energy theories. Everything was the brain is a little computer, and information processing is all what it's about, and it calculates what you're supposed to do, and then you do it. But we said, well, could this still be true? A lot of the data are looking like there's some energy involved there. So we started doing these laboratory experiments, and sure enough, after we'd have people first control their thoughts, tell them not to think about something, and then measure their physical stamina. And their physical stamina was worse. That trying to control their thoughts and shut that annoying thought out of their mind had actually taken something out of them. Or we had them watch a funny comedy and try to keep a poker face, don't laugh. And that took something out of them, and then they would do worse on another test of self-control. One of the biggest ones was we had people resist temptation to eat. We had to contrive this for a while. You can't tell people in psychology what you're going to study about them because it makes them all weird. If we told them we're going to test your self-control, you can imagine by the time they got to the laboratory, they'd be all shaken and suspicious and so on. So we told them we're just going to study how well people can remember certain tastes. So they come in, and then my colleagues came up with this clever thing where we set up a microwave oven and bake chocolate chip cookies. And the microwave blows out the scent, so it really smelled awfully good. And we told them to skip lunch, before the experiment, so their taste buds would be fresh. So they're hungry, and then they're all smelling these chocolates and cookies and all hungry for them. We sit them down at a table, and there's a stack of these cookies and chocolate candies looking all. And also there's a bowl of radishes. And for the crucial condition, we said, well, you've been assigned to the radish condition, so we're going to have you eat radishes and don't touch the chocolate or cookies that are for other people. And to maximize the temptation, we left them alone for 5 minutes. Of course, we didn't trust them, so we secretly observed, and they looked like they were tempted. They're longingly glancing at the cookies. They're gnawing on this one puny little radish. And they're picking up the cookies and smelling them and putting them back or dropping them on the floor. But anyway, they all managed. Nobody actually bit into the forbidden food, and they all managed to eat the better part of a radish. We had others who we told go ahead and eat the chocolates, and we also had some with no food. But the ones who were interested in the ones who had to sit there seeing those chocolates and smelling those chocolates and wanting those chocolates, but instead had to make themselves eat those stupid radishes. So after a few minutes, they resisted temptation. Then we took them into another room, and borrowed procedure from stress researchers is how long do people keep trying at a difficult puzzle before they give up? And sure enough, they quit way faster if they'd been in the radish condition. Resisting the temptation to eat those cookies had taken something out of them that then they didn't have enough to make themselves keep trying and keep going and keep struggling to solve that difficult puzzle. So anyway, lots and lots of these experiments suggest that, there's some kind of energy that's used up, and as John said, the old folk notion of willpower has some truth to it, that the mind is not just a computer, although computers run on energy too, although nobody was talking about that in psychology. But rather there are some energy processes, and some things take more than others. So that was a crucial step forward. What else?
After you discovered that willpower was this kind of mental energy, there were a couple questions that came up. One was, how do you, what is the source of this energy?
Okay. Well, it emerged over time that it seems to be tied into the body's basic energy supply. There's a chemical called glucose in your bloodstream, that carries energy from the stores. It makes fuel for the brain cells to fire. Also powers your muscles and other things like that. And nutritionists had collected a lot of data over time without much of a theory that when people's blood sugar gets low and they don't have that much glucose, their self-control breaks down. And diabetics who actually have fluctuating, sometimes they have very high blood sugar, but it doesn't do them any good because their body isn't using it. They have self-control problems. Also studies of like juvenile delinquents and other people, they seem to have blood sugar issues. They experimentally test things like they'll have to tell a whole class of kids to not have breakfast one day. So all the kids come and nobody's eating anything. They randomly assign half the kids to get breakfast and half to not get any breakfast. And then they see what happens. And sure enough, the ones who didn't get any food, they learn worse and they behave worse until 10 o'clock when everybody gets a snack, and then all the differences disappear. There's even a study with judges. I didn't get into the decision-making thing yet, but it turns out making decisions also draws on the same energy. So after you make a lot of choices, your willpower's down. I'm surprised politicians haven't started using this as an excuse for all the sex scandals and stuff. Well, I'm making a lot of difficult decisions, you know. It uses up. But, you know, it would be valid. We do get that kind of effect in there. Anyway, there's a study with Israeli parole judges. It looks at, do they do the easy thing and just send them right back, or do they actually let the ones who've paid their debt and earned it, be paroled and go out in society? Well, it turns out first one comes up in the morning has a very good chance of getting parole. But the judges are making these decisions all day long, and it's a lot of information and it's kind of grueling. And so the likelihood that the guy will get paroled just goes down, down, down as the day goes on, until actually mid-morning they have a break and they get a snack and they get an apple and so forth. And then suddenly the next guy has a good chance of getting paroled again. And then it goes down, down, down until just before lunch is like a 10 or 15% chance of getting paroled, whereas the first one after lunch has like 2/3 chance of getting in. So if you're ever in this situation, which I hope you're not, and they say, well, we can take one more before lunch, say, no, I'll wait till after lunch, because it really makes a big difference. I mean, there's a phrase lawyers use that justice is what the judge had for breakfast, but it appears breakfast, snack, and lunch all have a significant impact into the decision-making process there. So it is tied into the energy supply. When the immune system, for example, uses a lot, I know there are a lot of colds and things going around. If you've been exposed to something like that, your body immune system takes a lot of energy to fight off the cold. In that case, your decisions will be worse, your self-control will be worse. It's just a natural process. There's nothing wrong with you. Just you got to understand the body has a certain economy of how it uses its energy, resisting temptation, or behaving properly, or not saying something unkind. That's one of its priorities. But fighting disease is a higher priority, and so there'll be less left over for it at that time.
Mm-hmm. So. This discovery by Roy's of willpower and the fact that it can be depleted, he named it ego depletion, which he borrowed the term from Freud, that the part of your mind that controls your impulses. And so ego depletion, sets in on everyone. It basically, the same way those judges became depleted as the day wore on and couldn't make a decision. It's been documented in lots of studies where they've looked at shoppers in malls, and they find that people who've done the more shopping have less self-control later. They've done some really interesting real-world studies with car buyers, where they start out someone who buys a car and he has to go down this list of options about what kind of engine. You might have 13 different kinds of engines and 200 different colors for the interior. Is it taupe or camel or ivory? There's so many shades of brown. And what they find is that people will start trying to make the decision, but as they go down the list, they just give up and they start taking the default option. And the researchers experimented with that, and they varied the order of the decisions. Sometimes they put the expensive decisions, like the engine, first. Sometimes they put the expensive decisions last. And then it made a huge difference in what people chose, about $2,000 per car. And so Our message
because
is
the standard option is often one of the more expensive ones. So,
right.
As people go and just take whatever standard as their willpower gets used up and they don't want to think about and make any more choices, they just say, okay, I'll just take whatever standard.
Right.
And that can cost you.
Yeah. So our take is that all of us really like those car buyers today because we're just bombarded by decisions and temptations all day long. The modern world really offers you a lot more than there ever were before. One study Roy
bring
did.
up the President Obama thing you mentioned earlier. After he read the Times coverage of our stuff, he said, well, I'm just going to wear blue and gray suits from now on. I don't want to spend any energy deciding what to wear or what to eat.
Right. And so make no more decisions. That was his reaction, which is a good strategy to do that. Because some more research of Roy has and some researchers in Germany and in the Netherlands, they've tracked people all day long and asked them what they're experiencing at any one moment. And they found that the typical person during a day spends between 3 and 4 hours resisting desires, basically. Just, the desire to eat, the desire to yawn at your boss, the desire to, just having to exert self-control. And that didn't even really count all the decisions they have to make, which is even more.
Yeah.
So
a lot of demands on it, yeah.
So you're basically being depleted all day long. And so we've... in Willpower, we talked about the findings behind this, and we also, just to give you help with the New Year's resolutions, what we promised to do, I'll sort of break down summarize this. In the great spirit of self-help books, you have to have numbered laws, you know that. And I'm going to do better than 7.5, I'm going to do 8. So here are 8 strategies for the New Year's resolution, which is number 1, which is know your limits. Basically what I've just been saying, that you only have a finite amount of willpower, and the more you use it, it gets depleted. So, as far as New Year's resolution, the first thing to know about that is don't make more than one, because if you make more than one, they're competing against each other.
But can I add... this is exactly right. If people make a list of New Year's resolutions and every time you work on one, it uses up some willpower and takes away your ability to work on others. And I don't want to say don't make New Year's resolutions, but do them sequentially rather than all at once. Pick the easiest one and do that first, because you can actually strengthen your willpower by following through and doing and succeeding at it. So start with the easy one. But one at a time.
Right. And there's no obvious sign. Roy and other researchers looked for what does it feel like when you're suffering from ego depletion, when your willpower is low. And what's the answer to that?
There's no particular signature feeling, but everything strikes you a little bit more intensively. You desire things more, you react more strongly, and so on. So when your willpower's down, you'll just feel things more strongly. Things start bothering you more than they should. It could be a sign you're getting sick, because again, that uses up some of your glucose.
Because you've lost the capacity to control your reactions.
Yeah, people are often damping down their reactions. It's part, I think, of how we live in a civilized society, is we kind of keep all our desires and feelings and nasty sexual museum type thoughts in check. And
not
so
nasty.
Well, the nice ones too, but particularly the nasty ones have to be kept in check. So they'll emerge a little more strongly when your central self-control is weakened.
Okay. So the second strategy is to build your willpower. And Roy likes to use the analogy about willpower being like a muscle. Do you want to explain that?
Sure. Like a muscle, the depletion effect is like a muscle. When you exercise it or exert it, it gets tired for a while. But if you exercise regularly, it will get stronger. And there are at least a dozen published studies, often very impressive results, that show if having people do self-control exercises for 2 or 3 weeks can improve their capacity to do things quite different from what they exercised. They'll bring them in, we'll give them lab tests of self-control that had nothing to do with the exercises they were doing. But there's one muscle for self-control, and it's one resource that you use the same willpower for everything. It's limited, so people use it for one thing, not others. But making it, exercising it will make it stronger, and that will help you tackle whatever other challenges you decide to apply it to.
And the kind of exercise, in the experiments, they did one where they just sent students home and told them to work on their posture the next 2 weeks.
Right.
And whenever you think of it, just sit up straight, stand up straight.
Right, and somewhat to our surprise, we brought them in and did laboratory tests of stamina and mental control and things like that. And they did better on those things just from working on their posture. The old Victorian idea of building character, that exerting self-control is good for you. Well, it turns out they were right about that too, or at least there's something to it, that it does strengthen your character. It makes you a stronger person to exert self-control on a regular basis.
And that's probably one of the reasons that studies have repeatedly shown that religious people tend to have more self-control than non-religious people. Now, part of that may be a selection bias. It takes a certain amount of self-control to go to church and do that. But all religions encourage these practices: meditation, prayers, fasting. They encourage all these exercises that basically build that willpower muscle. Now, you don't have to be religious to do it, but just meditating builds up that. Now, I'll move on. I want to open this up for questions soon, but I'll work through the strategies. The number 3 strategy is the best one: eat. That you have to eat to have self-control. I love to do that in a place with food. And this is what we call the dieter's catch-22. It's why dieting, people often think of dieting as the ultimate example of self-control. It's an easy example to use. But of all the things that Roy have and researchers have studied, self-control correlates with success in everything. But when it comes to losing weight, the correlation is much weaker than it is, say, with academic stuff. And that's because of this complicated reaction that if you starve yourself, you don't have self-control. So it's this catch-22 that in order to diet, in order to have self-control, you need to eat, but in order to lose weight, you need not to eat. So it's very difficult. Yeah. The fourth strategy is to avoid the planning fallacy, which is this is something that all of us tend to underestimate how long something will take. It's one of the problems in making plans for the new year. And one of our studies, you found that other people basically underestimated how long it would take to do a paper by about half, right?
Yes. So there are a number of studies like this. There's one where they ask students, what's the best case and your worst case for how long it will take you to get your thesis done? And nobody even finished by the worst case. So the best case was off the charts. The only accurate predictions they got in that study was sometimes they asked the roommate, how long do you think it's going to take you to get it done? The roommates knew.
The fifth strategy is to make a to-do list that's actually doable. And the problem most people have is that they put stuff on to-do lists that it's a vague thing like hire a new sales rep, but you don't really know how to do that. You have to be, it has to be very specific. I'll just mention very quickly one of my favorite findings in the book, which was about the Zeigarnik effect, which is this an effect discovered in the 1920s by Bluma Zeigarnik, a psychology student in Berlin. And she went to a restaurant with some colleagues one day, and the waiter took their order. And he didn't write anything down. It was a big group. And he came back, served everybody perfectly. They were really impressed. After lunch, one of the psychologists goes back because he's forgotten something. And he sees the waiter, and he asks him for help, hoping he'll benefit from this man's excellent memory. And the waiter just looks back at him blankly. He has no idea who the guy is. And he explains that once he delivers an order, it vanishes from his mind. So the psychologists start thinking, is there a big difference between finished and unfinished tasks? And they found indeed that there is, that the brain keeps nagging at you at an unfinished task. Now, obviously, when you've got 200 emails and you've got phone calls and all these things, you can't finish every task at once. So stuff is going to nag at you. But Roy found a way in his laboratory where to turn off that Zeigarnik effect, basically.
Yes, if you make a very specific plan for exactly what you're going to do, that seems to turn off the nagging effect. A general plan, like buy a present for mother or something, that isn't there. But go to the store tomorrow at 3. These intrusive thoughts about the unfinished business, unfulfilled goals, the unconscious is bothering the consciousness, not to get it done necessarily, but to give it something very specific that it can watch for and say, okay, when this happens, then I'll know to take the next step. And that's all the unconscious needs. And then it can stop pestering you with those intrusive thoughts that you haven't put away the dirty dishes, the clean dishes. Put away the dirty dishes.
A great guide for doing that is the book Getting Things Done by David Allen, the GTD system. I'm sure many people here know that, but one of our favorite experiences doing the book was we went and visited David Allen in California, and it's an amazing experience. You go into his office. He's got about this big L-shaped desk. It's about 6 feet on each side, and you look at it, and it's 12 feet of naked wood. There's nothing in his inboxes, nothing on his desk. That's his whole system. Is you've got to get rid of stuff. You've got to basically get rid of the Zygarnik effect. You've got to, everything that comes on his desk, every email, he makes a plan to deal with it. He's got tickler files, and and the result is you've got a clean mind to do what you can. I mean, David likes to say that, that if you need cat food and you want to find God, you have to get the cat food first. Don't. And he's got lots of tips for basically making to-do lists and getting stuff done. So it's very specific. Now we're moving on here. Number 6, very basic strategy, but it's overlooked sometimes. Is it's not enough just to set goals and resolutions for the new year. You have to keep track. That's just fundamental to all exercise of self-control, is setting a goal and keeping track. If you want to spend less money, keep track of it every week. If you want to lose weight, weigh yourself every day. That's one of the few clinically proven ways to lose weight. So.
Yes, ironically, for years the conventional wisdom had been don't weigh yourself every day because weight fluctuates and it'll be discouraging and so on. And that was the one thing that went against what we were saying, because we thought keeping track is better. It's hard to control something if you're not keeping track of it. But then a study came out about 2 or just before we did the book that said, the people who actually weigh themselves every day do the best at keeping their weight down and keeping control of it.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we.
Yeah. Keeping track is kind of a bore, but the nice thing is that there are lots of smartphone apps. There's a website called The Quantified Self that has all these apps and gadgets that will keep track of what you do on your computer. It'll even it'll shut off the web. There's some apps that will send a note to your boss telling you how much time you spent on the Museum of Sex website, on the Reason website, if you want. All these things basically to monitor you, what you spend your time on, and how many steps you take, everything. So just keeping track is a very basic thing. And it is easier now because there's a lot of technology that will do it for you. Strategy number 7 is what we call the nothing alternative, which is named, which we borrowed from Raymond Chandler, the great mystery writer. He managed to turn out masterpieces like The Big Sleep by following. He would go into his office every day for hours, and he would follow. He had 2 rules: A, you don't have to write; B, you can't do anything else. And his idea was that eventually you're going to get so bored you'll do the work, and that's and so I think that's a great strategy for anyone to say take the first 90 minutes of your day. Open the smartwatch, the smartphone app for for a stopwatch, and don't do anything apart from your primary project that day. No phone calls, no web stuff, only stuff that's related to your primary project. And now I'm down to strategy number 8, the final one, and this is really the most important one because it's conserve your willpower.
I thought you were going to say buy our book.
Well, that's the 8th and a half. This is the one that President Obama was doing, and this flows. I mean, from another study that Roy did with some colleagues that surprised them because they were tracking people all day long, and I'll let Roy just to remind you of it though that, and they found that, and they were looking for the correlation between people who had best self-control and how often they exercise self-control, and they expected that the people with the best self-control would be using it all day long because they were so strong. But they found the opposite, right?
Yeah, significantly the other way. The people with high self-control actually spend less time resisting temptations and desires. And so, well, how could that be? But they stay out of trouble. We call this in the book playing offense, not defense. A lot of people think self-control is something you use in the moment of crisis, in the heat of temptation or whatever, that's when you call on it. Well, the people with good self-control plan not to be exposed to temptation. They set up their lives to run smoothly, and then they don't have these problems. And that actually works way better.
Right. It is the kind of thing where, I mean, what Obama was doing basically was outsourcing his self-control, his decisions to someone else. And now we don't all have the kind of staff he does, to someone else to choose your food for you. But you can outsource, instead of deciding every morning whether to exercise or not, you can just set up an appointment with a friend. So you basically outsource that self-control. You don't have to make yourself do it. And you can outsource a lot of this stuff, to computers that will nudge you when to do things, friends that will do it, Facebook groups, that kind of thing.
There's a huge benefit between good self-control and success in work and school. You think, well, what do you need willpower for there? Is it for staying up all night to get the paper done or the presentation for the next day? Well, I suppose that does take it, but that's not what people with good self-control do. They start early and get it done ahead of time, so they don't have to spend the night before the deadline staying up all night.
Now, I used to hate to hear this because I've been a procrastinator all my life. I don't think I've ever turned in a New York Times column ahead of time, usually after the deadline. And I never turned in college papers on time. When I started working with Roy and started doing these strategies, we actually turned in the book 2 months ahead of time. And our editor is still not recovered from the shock of it. I think the writers' union wanted to break our hands, if we had to do this. So I can tell you that the strategies do work, and we'd be glad to take any more questions from you if you'd like.
What is the magnitude? Sure, yeah. So when you're talking about both preserving your willpower and exercising it to grow it, what is the magnitude of difference you can expect from these as compared to the magnitude we know genetics plays from the separated twin literature?
Right. So you want an answer like in percent of the variance or something like that? I mean, I don't know quite how to answer. I can compare. The genetic effects are mostly interactive with. It turns out pure gene effects are fairly small in most things. Maybe not with intelligence, but most other things. It's the interaction between the genes and environment. The pure environment effects are even smaller. But interactions between them seem to be where the lion's share of the variance is. I think with self-control, we do find when we give people these exercises, the people who start off with pretty good self-control benefit more from the exercises. But it's probably because they do the exercises more. The other people say, oh, yeah, I'll do them. But then they don't go home and they don't bother to work on their posture or not swear or whatever we assign them to do. Nonetheless, well, here's one way to put it. One of my former PhD students published a paper about 2-3 years ago. We try to get people to quit smoking, and that's one of the hardest. I mean, quitting smoking is the graveyard of psychological theories. Nothing works. But he had a bunch of people and had them do exercises for several weeks of regulating, resisting their desires and being good and stuff like that. So it had nothing to do with smoking. You just build up their willpower with sort of simple self-control exercises, and then had them try to quit smoking. And it tripled the success rate, which went like from 5% to 15%. It's not like 90% of them suddenly were there. But still, 5% to 15, that's a huge effect there.
Hello, I'm Stanton Peel, and in 4 weeks I'm going to be appearing here with John and Sally Sattel talking about addiction. John, I was really curious. When you began, you talked about how we've gone downhill in terms of our views of self-help because in an earlier era we were more willing to recognize self-control, and now that's almost a negative concept that you have to market against. So I was going to ask you why you think that is, and before I get your answer, I want to propose why I think that is. I think you're marketing against the entire addiction model of powerlessness, which comes both from AA, but also modern neuroscience, and the hijacked brain. Mm-hmm. So how I interpret your work in my most recent book, Recover, is that we've gone away from something that makes a lot of logical common sense because we've been told that we're not able to exercise self-control. Mm-hmm. And I view the world as being a kind of marketing of memes, and you're coming back with an idea, well, willpower and self-control, everybody knows from history they make sense. Mm-hmm. How come we've discarded them? Do you where do you see our loss of that idea coming from?
Well, we can both talk about this. I think part of it is that it's more fun to market things, that here's an easy way to do it. That's the power of positive thinking, that if you just, Napoleon Hill, I would read these old books and I just couldn't, believe this stuff, that Napoleon Hill he's sold just countless, it's still being sold today. There's, tens of millions of books. And he had a strategy where if you wanted to make money, you first had to think exactly how much money you wanted, then write it down on a piece of paper, and then every day pick up that piece of paper and look at it. And that's how you got it, I can understand why people like to believe that kind of stuff. Maybe it's a religious belief. It's a lot easier than actually going to work. There was also, I think, one reason, just historical, was the Triumph of the Will, the Nazi documentary, that when Hitler is doing is the spokesman for willpower. That's not good for your brand. I think.
Roy, what do you think of the first step of AA?
Oh, well, I have to say I've been much influenced by your writings on the topic, and I appreciate the chance to meet you. But very much right on among other points, the people who are addicted, they like the idea that it's beyond their control and that it's a hopeless thing. So the victim mentality really appealed to both the addicts and to the medical for-profit establishment that treats them. The idea that it just takes willpower to resist it, that's not nearly as appealing. And then there's the bias of what they study. Most people who ever smoked have quit smoking, but they did it on their own. Only a minority have done it in these professional programs. And I think the way to the evidence is starting to show that the people who who have trouble quitting addictions, who are in these programs, they often have multiple psychological problems. And so they are kind of hopeless cases, but it's a huge mistake to treat them as the norm. It's a bit like the old idea that homosexuals are neurotic, and that psychology embraced that for a long time. But they were dealing with people in therapy who had multiple problems, and finally other homosexuals came forward and said, "Well, we're not neurotic. We're healthy, and we want to be recognized as such." But that's not going to happen with addiction, because all the addicts benefit from the idea that it's out of their power. There's the AA philosophy has a built-in contradiction when it says, well, you can't do it. You need to surrender to a higher power. But meanwhile, you better get busy and do all these other things and actually quit yourself. So the higher power is not swatting the beer bottle away. You're actually doing it yourself.
Do you see yourself as actually being in conflict and battling with that kind of a cultural concept that's being promulgated all the time?
Do I see myself that way? Our book didn't really address addiction or tackle it on, but
you had a whole chapter. Come on now.
My subsequent work and thinking about it, I guess you're right. I've read a lot more since then, and so yes, I think the weight of the evidence just doesn't sustain the idea that addiction is something that's out of your control. Again, to go back to the alcohol thing, the beer doesn't pour itself down your throat. The cigarette doesn't light itself and put in your mouth. People are really voluntarily cooperating to ingest these substances. It goes with all these things about giving yourself permission and allowing yourself to do it and taking a short-term instead of a long-term focus. All these things really play into addiction and sustained addiction, and that's I think what contributes. And so when people tell themselves, well, I can't really help it, I'm addicted, they give themselves excuses, and in that way that contributes to making it worse.
I'm wondering if you could talk about what's the connection between people that commit crimes and a lack of willpower, if any, and are there any implications for how to fight recidivism?
Way back when I started writing my first scholarly book on self-control around 1990, I was reading literature, and right then a book came out called A General Theory of Crime. I was struck by that because it was by criminologists, not by psychologists. I wanted to know, what are they going to talk about? Poverty or relative deprivation or disadvantaged youth or whatever. And they said low self-control was the key to understand it. And I thought, oh, okay, that's quite striking. Obviously, after that bold statement came out, there was a flood of research in criminology trying to test and see whether that's true, and that has continued to hold up. It's been confirmed over and over again that, yes, I mean, there are lots of kinds of evidence, going back to the original thing. Criminals, the act of committing the crime certainly is a sign of low self-control. Criminals don't specialize like they do in the movies, where they're just like any other professional. They tend to get arrested over and over again for different crimes. It's just an impulsive lifestyle. Others have looked at what criminals do on legal things, and there they show low self-control too. Criminals are more likely to smoke cigarettes, to be late for work if they have jobs, to be involved in unplanned pregnancies and traffic accidents and all sorts of things. It's just sort of a general screw-up lifestyle that contributes to it. So that appears to be true. In fact, the paper just came across my desk today linking low self-control to a variety of minor public misbehaviors, including drunk dialing, binge drinking. There's academic fraud, which is a bit more serious. Even we're all adults. Public flatulence is associated. It's John and I prefer to speak to audiences with higher self-control. So that is true. Now, my colleague John Tierney has been doing research in prisons with, if we developed a trait scale to measure self-control. She said it is a huge predictor of recidivism, that prisoners who have higher self-control within the range they have are less likely to be rearrested when they leave. And if they can bolster and train them in self-control in some ways, it really reduces their chances of being rearrested. You probably also know, going to the nutrition and glucose thing, criminals tend to eat very bad diets. I initially read one of the memoirs of the gang wars, where I had another book on evil and violence. I remember reading, a guy said, well, when we were in gang wars, I remember we started feeling really bad, and I wondered if it was all the junk food. As it turns out, when they're in the middle of a gang war, they don't go home at 6 o'clock and have a nice, healthy meal with leafy vegetables and greens and stuff like that. They stop at fast food places and eat junk food and stuff, and that's really bad for your glucose over time. They've done systematic studies in prisons where they'll take the diet and improve it, for half the population and not the others. And the ones who take the vitamin supplements and eat vegetables, their disciplinary problems in prison drop by half, as long as the study. And then as soon as the study's over, then they go back to getting in trouble again. So diet, training, self-control, all those things are really useful in combating crime, and it continues to be. I guess they won't say it's the key anymore. Things in social science get more complicated over time, but it's still a major key and probably the biggest single predictor of criminality.
It's also gone the other way in that there's a huge study in New Zealand where they track kids for decades, and they had a lot of measures of self-control when they were young by their teachers, their parents, and tests, and they found that it predicted bad outcomes and everything, and it did predict your likelihood of being in jail, basically. So. Yeah.
How well a kid did at self-control at age 10 predicted whether he'd have been arrested by age 30.
A question in the right corner over here. Do you draw any distinction? Hi. Do you draw any distinction between discipline and obeying rules and self-control? And also, do you find that the positive effects have sort of a diminishing, or ultimately diminish for people who are, particularly persnickety or neurotic or anal, just by nature and their personality?
Go ahead. A couple of key points. Self-control is a broader term than discipline, but discipline is certainly an important instance of it, and following rules. And it's one of the things we evolved to do. It's what makes humans separate from others is we're able to create civilization, but civilization only works if most of the people follow most of the rules most of the time. So that capacity to do it. I sometimes, when I lecture on human nature, I say, well, if we hired a gorilla and gave him a job and a car and an apartment and so on, why wouldn't that work? But you can't consistently obey the rules enough to sustain civilized society. Now, your other question, diminishing returns. We've looked for that. When it turns out there is such a thing as, say, the over-controlled child, but that's not an excess of self-control. That's it's basically a fearful outlook from being overly inhibited or something like that. When we test self-control, I told you Tang and I developed this scale to measure it, and we thought it would be really cool if we could show that it goes up and up in terms of the benefits, and then at the high levels turns down. We beat the statistics every which way to try to get that downturn, and we just could not find it. It seemed like as far as within the normal range, the more self-control you have, the better. And you can put it to bad things, and there are traits, as you say, like being anal and so on. But the people who have these compulsive traits and so on, they're not highly self-controlled. In fact, they say, I'm lacking self-control. They see their indulgence. They're sort of trying these other things as a way to try to reestablish some control. So it's not an excess of self-control. I think self-control, like intelligence, it's a tool. You can use it for bad things, but basically the more you have, the better.
Okay. This is really helpful because I think it explains, but I want to vet an approach that I've been developing that works and doesn't seem like it should make sense. So the first thing is the difference between affirmative statements and I guess what are now called interrogative self-interrogative statements. So like you get up in the morning and instead of saying, I will exercise today, if you say, will I exercise today, you're more likely to exercise, right? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Which one is more likely to work? The affirmative,
when you
right?
ask, no, the affirmative statement lets your self-conscious sort of off the hook. Yeah, I've committed to exercising, so I don't have to worry about it. And then you're going to bed and you say, damn, I forgot to exercise. Whereas if you keep asking yourself, will I exercise? The only way of answering that is by exercising, right? So that's the first thing. So I use those two. I mean, there's a lot of research recently on this. So I use those two. So then the first case, when I don't want to do something, I say I'll do it. And so then I just forget about it. And like you say, and the other thing is you say, when you put the thing that's not really doable on the list, it sort of nags you. But the corollary to that is if you can not be nagged by it, you don't have to do it. Right? So I put all these things on the list that my wife wants done, and it's on the list, and then I don't do it. Does that make any sense? So you look confused.
No.
And there's a wonderful thing called, there's this guy out at Stanford, I can't remember his name, Perry, I think it was his name. He wrote a thing called structured
Procrastination. Structured procrastination.
And I wonder what you think of that, because that certainly works for me.
I didn't know the procrastination thing.
Structured procrastination, I like to call it the power of positive procrastination, which is the way to get, say to clean your closet out is to put at the top of your list, do taxes. And so to avoid doing taxes, you will clean your closet. And you basically, and there are funny stories about it. And the guy who does it is very funny. I mean, he says, I accomplish all this stuff because he just has these impossible things at the top of the list. So to avoid doing them, he'll do the other stuff. So, and I mean, there actually is something to be said for, if you're stuck on something, just, you clean. I mean, it's often said freelance writers have the cleanest houses around. They just will do anything rather than write. So, but I think that with the Zeigarnik effect, you just end up being nagged by it all the time. It's just so much better to, just say I'm going to do it for 90 minutes. Whatever happens, happens. But I won't do anything else, and then you're free the rest of the day.
Right. I guess I put it down so I give the list to my wife so she doesn't nag.
Yeah, we've skipped over a couple of times children, discipline, and impulsivity, which connecting those dots, I got to ADHD. And, a key characteristic of ADHD is impulsivity, which seems to be remarkably controlled by these medications. Does that mean that these medications also somehow increase willpower?
I don't know how those medications work, and I don't
Well,
know that
do
we
you have
know.
a neurological, have you mapped willpower neurologically? Because what they say is the medications work by stimulating your prefrontal cortex, which is where your higher management functions is, and presumably where your willpower is.
Yes. I'm not a brain person, but I have a bunch of colleagues who have done that kind of work. And, in broad terms, yes, you're right. The front of the brain is more the control part. The back is the wanting and urging part. But exactly how self-control works there, it's been surprisingly difficult for them to get that mapped and ascertain exactly what happens with depletion. There are just some new studies coming out in the last couple of years starting to show which regions work with it. But to go from there then to the drug operation, that's another big step. So if you're looking for a way to increase willpower, the idea of, it's appealing to think I can just take a pill and then I'll have great willpower. But I wouldn't bet on that.
I was more wondering whether kids with ADHD are doomed to poor willpower.
Well, they do have great focus, though, when it comes to, especially, entrepreneurs often have ADHD, and they're very focused on one thing when they can do it. So, I wonder if the drugs you're doing are basically the effect of, like, your computer shutting you off the web. It's just not letting certain stimuli come through and letting you focus on one. This is a very crude, analogy for it, but there have also been some brain studies trying to look at. Roy's experiments at looking what actually at the physical mechanics of self-control. They've done experiments where they give people a glass of lemonade, either with Splenda or sugar, and you do the sugar not because it's a great thing for you, because it works very quickly. And a glass of lemonade will improve your willpower right away. That people have more, but it doesn't work if there's not sugar in it, because you want that glucose. And there have been some brain studies now where they're trying to see what happens when that sugar goes in, actually, right, and to see.
Yes, it does seem to reverse some of the patterns that show up when people are depleted. But again, brain research is messy at present and very imprecise.
Our next guest here at the next session is Sally Sattel, who's been pretty skeptical of the brain stuff. So she's been
good.
So.
Hi, I was wondering if you would speculate on our evolutionary history, so that our ancestors probably wouldn't have a problem with willpower if they were getting attacked by a tiger. They'd know what to do. So I wonder how much of this is a mismatch with just things that are evolutionarily familiar versus things that are evolutionarily novel. So taxes is something completely novel. So would you speculate on how general willpower might have come about?
All right. I think, well, first of all, we think we don't have that much willpower, but we have more than other species. The glass is half full and half empty. We can all imagine life would be better if we had better self-control than we do. But as I said, the kind of civilized society that we create, we don't see other creatures being able to do that, to behave that flexibly and understand complex hierarchies of rules and so forth. So the key to human evolution was learning to work together socially in these new systems, particularly to reach beyond the kin group and the basic genetic selfishness that produces what limited cooperation there is in other species. So you need to control your behavior, need to subdue impulses to go along and comply with the rules of the group. And as I think these would have co-evolved as our ancestors developed better self-control, for managing themselves. They were able to construct more complicated social systems that were then more effective, and so in time, the groups with the more effective social systems were able to supplant and defeat their rivals who didn't have as much.
I mean, there are examples people point out just in primates having some self. I mean, dogs have self-control. There have been experiments where you can do ego depletion with a dog if he obeys a command, a stay or sit command for 10 minutes, and then you give him the doggy version of a puzzle to do. The dogs that have to obey the stay command for 10 minutes quit sooner than the dogs that were just relaxing inside a cage, and they can also be reversed with lemonade or with sugar. And there's some thought that just self-control evolved in very basic sense that in a group if there's an alpha male who gets to eat first, that the others have to exert self-control to not eat that food that's there, because if they don't, then the group's going to spend all its energy fighting, and they're not going to survive. And similarly, people have suggested that that our civilization, that ancient hunter-gatherers who could get tubers and not eat them right away when they were poisonous, but had the self-control to basically put them aside and do that all these things basically were essential for survival. And I think your point, though, about that we're somewhat mismatched is that throughout a lot of history, there were fairly simple rules, and in the Middle Ages, somebody didn't, have a lot of decisions all day long. You basically did one job. You got, the main temptations were getting drunk, which wasn't really even that bad a thing. Most people were drunk much of the time, and and adultery. But I mean, you weren't trying to decide what kind of career to go into. You had a very clear code of conduct that was enforced by God in your mind, by the church, by your neighbors. And the reason the Victorians got so obsessed with willpower is that they were concerned about all these villagers leaving their churches and their communities where there was social control, going into these cities, and suddenly people don't believe in God anymore. There's no church. So they really worried, how can we have people control themselves without feeling that there's a church and a God doing it? And so that was really the whole idea, that we have to inculcate character in people. And I think it's gotten worse today because we all have choices all day long about every second at your desk you can goof off, whereas a peasant in the field didn't have a lot of choices.
So how easily and how precisely can self-control be measured? Is there a standard scale, and is there a way that I can assess my own self-control?
Unfortunately, there's no single gold standard measurement. In our experiments, we do all these different behavioral things so we can compare one group against another and say, well, this group did worse than that group. That works, but they're all indirect. We do have, as I said, their personality scales. The one that John Tierney and I developed. It's a series of questions, but I think if you fill it out knowing that this is measuring your self-control, that could weaken the validity of it and make you want to just say, oh yeah, I'm really good. The questions, then it becomes obvious what they're getting at. I'm sorry to say the short answer is no. There's not an easy way to test it. You can maybe ask your wife or your roommate, and
I mean, in experiments, there are techniques like how long you can hold your hand in ice water, how long you can squeeze a grip, how long you work on a puzzle that's not solvable. Those are experimental ways to measure perseverance. So.
But those are all somewhat relative. I mean, the cold water bothers some people more than others, and so it takes more self-control for some people to do it than others.
I had a question whether willpower is just one element of self-control and what the impact of identity or ideology would be. And if you permit me, just a personal thing. So February is my clean month. So substance-wise, no weed, no alcohol, no caffeine. And especially on the alcohol, that's very difficult. But because I do it every year, I know I'm Scott. February's my clean month. I'm not tempted. And it's become very easy for me to do. So I don't rely on willpower. If I relied on willpower, I would fall short. I rely on sort of an identity and ideology. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, you're basically doing there the strategy we're talking about, conserving your willpower. And one of the ways to do that is what's called bright line rules. So basically, when you have a very clear rule, I mean, that's one of the reasons that not drink, it's much easier to stop drinking than to lose weight, because you can have a rule, a clear rule. I don't drink after 6. I don't drink at all. I don't drink in February. And that's easy to do, but you can't say I'm not going to eat. So it's not a bright line rule. And the more you can do these rules that are very clear and easy to follow, so you know when you've gone across it, it gets easier. And then, as you say, once you establish a rule, it's hard to do it at first, but then once it becomes a habit, it's not really a decision you're making anymore.
Right.
And then, therefore, you're not really depleting your willpower to do it.
I like the choice of February, too. It's the shortest month, so...
You got that right.
We have one. Okay. I want to ask one other question. It takes to his question, and it takes there is a very common view that willpower or self-control isn't a matter of your personal ability. It's not that much different from person to person. It's just a matter of how you manage it. How much would you say is willpower versus the management of your willpower?
It all depends if you've read our book or not. I think that's really it. That's the two basic groups you have, I think.
Yes, I would say they're both important. There are real differences. Going back to Walter Mischel and those marshmallow studies of the kids at age 4, how they performed in the lab test of being able to wait 10 minutes to eat the cookie or the marshmallow, predicted how well they did in college and how later on how much money they made in their careers. So there are differences there, but using it properly or misusing it, that's a large contributing factor as well. Some of those people who have very messed up lives could have had the willpower to do better, or maybe had it but just devoted it in the wrong things. There's things like overconfidence, thinking you have more willpower than you actually have. There's a study I liked where they took smokers and they said, you want to bet on yourself, can you watch this movie without smoking? And you can have there were different levels of, one is cigarettes are in the other room. It was a movie that glorified smoking. Cigarettes in the other room, and that was like worth, I think they did in Europe, so it was €3 if you could do that, versus have them on the table, it'd be €6. And the highest was you could get €12 if you could watch this movie holding an unlit cigarette in your mouth for it. So people say, oh, €12, yeah, I can do that. None of them completed that. The ones who said, I'll go for €3 and leave it in the other room, it's a much lower goal. As John said, go for reachable goals. They were much more successful at it. These were the same people. They were put into different...
Are there big differences in willpower or self-control from person to person? Or is it...
There are definitely differences, yes. There are substantial differences. But again, it sort of takes some self-control to manage your self-control right. So whether they could have done better if they had planned better and plotted and not exposed themselves to temptation. If you recognize your limitations, you're trying to not drink for a month, you don't spend as much time going into bars. But the person who thinks, I can go in, I'll just have a Coke. But then, then they fail. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dan Gluck, for hosting us. Thank you, Reason, for holding this. Thank you. That's it for the Museum of Sex. More bad self-help books than Oprah and Dr. Phil combined. That's what got me into this collaboration with Roy, really. It started indirectly for me, where I was at dinner one night with Christopher Buckley, the comic novelist, and we were talking about the deep philosophical subject that always comes up when writers get together, which is money. And we decided that we needed more of it. And we were so jealous of the mega sales of self-help books that we decided to write one of our own. And it was a comic novel titled God is My Broker. And we revealed the 7.5 laws of spiritual and financial growth. These were eternal truths like money is God's way of saying thanks. And my favorite law was, as long as God knows the truth, it doesn't matter what you tell your customers. Now, in writing this book, I went back through the history of the self-help genre, all the way from Ben Franklin to the present. And I noticed this sort of curious trend. If you went back in the 19th century and the Victorians, the self-help books then emphasized perseverance and hard work. They had maxims like, genius is patience. But then when you moved into the modern era, you got these books promising quick fixes and self-esteem and the sort of feel-good philosophy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm John Tierney. Welcome to the Museum of Sex here. I am here to talk with Roy Baumeister at this event. Thank you, Reason Magazine, for sponsoring this, and thank you, Dan Gluck, for inviting us here. I'm here to talk with Roy Baumeister, my co-author of the book Willpower, and we want to talk about that subject, about New Year's resolutions, and we want to also unveil a strategy, a self-help strategy that, as far as I know, is the only one to have been field tested in the Oval Office. After President Barack Obama read our work, he changed his daily routine to improve his decision making. Now, I'm not saying he made all the right decisions since then. I imagine there are some people here who do not regard him as the Solomon of our age. But I want to assure you that if he had not followed the strategy that Roy and I developed, that things today would be much worse. and I also want to assure you that it was not used, the strategy was not used to develop the healthcare.gov website. Now, I realize that there are probably many people here who are tired of hearing exhortations and lectures from self-improvement gurus. And believe me, I feel your pain. I have read more. And this was something that had been kind of out of fashion, but more and more studies started showing that no matter what kind of successful outcome you looked at it, in school, in careers, in marriages, in relationships, financial security, health, that in general there were two qualities that correlate with success. And one of them is intelligence, the other is self-control. And so far researchers haven't figured out what to do about intelligence, but they have rediscovered how to improve self-control. And they have rediscovered the concept of willpower, which until Roy came along, scientists in the 20th century had looked on willpower as this kind of quaint metaphor invented by uptight Victorians. You know, Victorians thought of the body like there was a steam engine inside you, and when you had some terrible temptation, like the sight of a bare ankle, you just powered up the steam engine and you went and you took a cold shower. And now, the Victorians were rather odd. I don't think they'd be really comfortable here at the Museum of Sex. But Roy discovered that they actually were correct. I mean, not about everything. He doesn't share their ankle fetish. But he discovered that they were right about willpower. And I'd like Roy now to tell us why, how that happened.
Well, we started doing experiments. I mean, first I surveyed the literature, and I thought, well, this could be that the willpower thing seemed viable, that there was some energy. At the time, nobody...
With a rhyming slogan, believe it, achieve it. You know, Deepak Chopra had something he called the law of least effort. And I'll quote it verbatim. It said, ultimately, you come to the state where you do nothing and accomplish everything. You know, I guess it worked for him, you know, but you know, to me it seemed there had been this weird backward evolution, that the old books were better than the new books. And I didn't know what to make of this until I started writing a science column for the New York Times, and I met Roy Baumeister. I heard he's one of the most prolific social psychologists on the planet. And Roy got his start. He was one of the early leaders in the research into self-esteem, which showed that people who are more confident, people with more confidence in themselves tend to be happier and more successful. But then Roy realized that the researchers had it backwards, that self-esteem does not lead to success, rather success leads to self-esteem. You know, winning the Nobel Prize will make you feel good about yourself, but feeling good about yourself will not get you to Stockholm. If it did, Donald Trump would be there every year. So Roy looked at dozens of personality traits, and he found that only one of them predicted how well a student would do in college. And that trait, it was not self-esteem, it was self-control.
In psychology was using energy theories. Everything was, the brain is a little computer and information processing is all what it's about, and it calculates what you're supposed to do and then you do it. But we said, well, could this still be true? A lot of the data are looking like there's some energy involved there. So we started doing these laboratory experiments, and sure enough, after we'd have people first control their thoughts, tell them not to think about something, and then measure their physical stamina. And their physical stamina was worse. That trying to control their thoughts and shut that annoying thought out of their mind had actually taken something out of them. Or we had them watch a funny comedy and try to keep a poker face, don't laugh. And that took something out of them, and then they would do worse on another test of self-control. One of the biggest ones was we had people resist temptation to eat. We had to contrive this for a while. You can't tell people in psychology what you're going to study about them because it makes them all weird. If we told them we're going to test your self-control, you can imagine by the time they got to the laboratory, they'd be all shaken and suspicious and so on. So we told them we're just going to study how well people can remember certain tastes. So they come in, and then my colleagues came up with this clever thing where we set up a microwave oven and bake chocolate chip cookies. And the microwave blows out the scent, so it really smelled awfully good. And we told them to skip lunch, before the experiment, so their taste buds would be fresh. So they're hungry, and then they're all smelling these chocolates.